Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Bruce. I'm a professor of medieval history at Fordham University in New York. I study the history of medieval Christianity, and I'm particularly interested in some of those esoteric aspects of Christian medieval history. The undead, dragons, the afterlife, things like that. Over the past few years, I've had the very good fortune to work with Penguin Classics to publish historical anthologies of texts related to some of these subjects. In 2016, I published the Penguin Book of the Undead, 1,500 years of supernatural encounters, from Homer to Shakespeare. All sorts of stuff about apparitions and revenants, ghosts and zombies, things like that. I'm currently at work on the Penguin Book of Dragons, which is due to come out in 2021. But I'm here today to tell you about the Penguin Book of Hell. This is a historical anthology about the punitive afterlife. The idea that for some of us, perhaps many of us, the afterlife will involve a considerable amount of suffering. Where did this concept come into being? Why? And especially, why has it perpetuated for so long? So this is what I'm going to talk about right now. Hell is a powerful, enduring construct of the imagination, perhaps the most powerful, enduring construct of the human imagination, certainly in the Western world. Why is that? Why do we have a need for hell? Why do we think that people should be punished in the so-called life to come? Why has this idea had such tenacity for thousands upon thousands of years? I tend to study it in its Christian context, but hell is a much older concept. It goes back to the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Mesopotamians, very much alive in the Greek and Roman world, just under a different name. The ancient Hebrews too, of course, just under a completely different name and a different religious system. So for the next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the pre-Christian history of hell. That is, where do some of these concepts and images of hell arise? And then we'll talk a little bit about the appropriation of ancient concepts of hell by the Christians and how that looked, how they imagined hell and what happened there. And then we'll look at some challenges to hell. How is hell reinterpreted? It's not a monolith. It's a historical phenomenon that changes over time. And we'll look at its enduring influence. This is a lot to cover in 10 or 15 minutes, but we'll do our best. So the idea of the punitive afterlife is, in fact, as I said, very old. Many cultures have this. Historians speculate a great deal about why this is so. What is it about, what do human beings need in an afterlife that is so terrible? Well, most ancient afterlives weren't very good to begin with. At the very best, they were just dull and boring. Only the great heroes of antiquity got to enjoy the pleasant afterlife of the Elysian fields and other places like that. For most of us, it was a place that was dull as dust. It was gray, it was lifeless, not much went on there, and we either stayed there forever or we were resurrected into some kind of other form. Resurrect, I guess, is the right word. Even so, we have in many pieces of ancient literature, from Homer's Odyssey to Virgil's Aeneid, we have stories about heroes going down to the underworld. And sometimes when they're in the underworld, they witness certain parts of this subterranean place that are set aside specifically to punish people for things that they've done. And it says a lot about a culture when we can investigate the things that they feel merit eternal punishment in the afterlife. I'll read you right now a little snippet from Virgil's Aeneid. This was an epic poem about the founding of Rome that was written during the reign of Emperor Augustus, who died in 14 CE, written by the poet Virgil. And in this particular scene, Aeneas has gone down into the underworld as these ancient heroes always do, looking for answers to questions he can't find back in the world of the living. And while he's there, he kind of peeks around a corner at a part of the underworld called Tartarus. And some pretty nasty things are happening in Tartarus. This is the translation of Robert Fagles. Here those who hated their brothers while alive, or struck down their fathers, or embroiled clients in fraud, or brooded alone over troves of gold they gained and never put aside. Some share for their own kin, a great multitude these. Then those killed for adultery, those who marched to the flag of civil war and never shrank from breaking their pledge. To their lords and masters, all of them walled up here wait to meet their doom. don't hunger to know their doom, what form of torture or twist of fortune drags them down. Some trundle enormous boulders, others dangle, racked to the breaking point on the spokes of rolling wheels. Doomed Theseus sits on his seat, and there he will sit forever. Phlegyas, most in agony, sounds out his warning to all. His piercing cries bear witness through the darkness. Learn to bow to justice. Never scorn the gods. You all stand forewarned. Here's one who bartered his native land for gold. He saddled her with a tyrant, set up laws for a bribe, and for a bribe he struck them down. This one forced himself on his daughter's bed and sealed a forbidden marriage. All dared an outrageous crime, and what they dared, they did. No, not if I had 100 tongues and 100 mouths and a voice of iron too. I could never capture all the crimes or run through all the torments, doom by doom. And so what we have here in this description of people being tormented in Tartarus is a list of unacceptable activities in that society. Incest, civil war, gaining advantage in politics through bribery, all these different things that break down the social and the political fabric, these are punishable. Anything that is also an affront to the gods. If you offend the gods, then you are going to be punished in the afterlife. And so in a sense, we can read visions of hell, ancient visions of hell, as a kind of barometer of what society expects out of its citizens. And if you don't play by the rules, then the threat is that you will be forever tormented in the afterlife. Now, there's a suggestion to this that I'll return to at the end, which is this suggests that many people who break the rules don't get punished in this life. Why is that? Well, we'll come back to that. Now, the Christians appropriated, the early Christians, very early Christians, appropriated much of their imagery of their punitive afterlife from pagan literature, from the Greeks and the Romans, but also from the ancient Hebrews, of course. And the ancient Hebrews were the ones who introduced the idea of the fire that would not burn out. That is the unquenchable fire, and the worm that would not stop gnawing. So the themes of the fire and the worm are very strongly prevalent in early Christian ideas of hell. But very soon in the Christian tradition, only a couple of centuries after the advent of Christianity, we begin to see a tension. Heaven and hell in the early Christian tradition don't present us with many options, right? You're either going to heaven, where you will live in blessed peace with God in God's presence and the presence of the angels forever. Awesome, if you can do it, right? Or you go to hell if you are unbaptized, if you are a bad person, even if you're not a very good person. And so that is that's not looking good for a lot of us, right? Most of us are going to go the hell way because not all of us can live up to the standards of heaven. And early Christian authors seem to understand this, early Christian thinkers. And they began to formulate, especially in the 6th century, around the time of Pope Gregory the Great, they began to formulate this idea of a third place in the afterlife. And in effect, even though they inherited this idea of the punitive afterlife from the Romans, the Greeks, and from the ancient Hebrews, the Christians began to manipulate this idea and began to redraw, as it were, the map of the other world to include a third place known as Purgatory, a middling place where actually most of us will go. Hell, over the course of the medieval tradition, came to be reserved for the truly wicked people, right? Think of the most wicked people you can think of in the world, right? And think, whoa, are they going to go to, those are the people that are going to go to hell. Heaven is reserved for the very, very, very good, the saintly people. It's not you. It's not me either, honest to goodness, right? But most of us are going to this middle place, Purgatory. And the purpose of this place is embedded in the word purgatorium. It means to cleanse. It's a place where we're going to go for a little while to be cleansed of our sins until we enter heaven. Right? Now, how does the cleansing take place? Fire, of course, right? It's horrible. It's awful. But the big difference between purgatory and hell is that purgatory is not permanent. You're only there for a certain amount of time. It might be years, it might be decades, it might be centuries, or even millennia. But in the end, you will get out and you will go to heaven. Whereas hell is permanent. Hell is permanent. So in the medieval Christian tradition, hell looms over everything as this terrible, fearful place where you can end up. But it's the dichotomy of heaven and hell proved to be too much for medieval Christian thinkers, and they really had to formulate this idea, and maybe for believers too, who just balked at the idea they could never be good enough to go to heaven, and thus were doomed to hell. So over the course between the 6th and the 12th century, we really have the development of this place called Purgatory. Even so, hell was something to be feared, and medieval authors thought a great deal, poets, monks, thought a great deal about what hell was like. What is the landscape like? What are the contours like? What are the punishments like? And some of these we know very well. All right. You know, we all know Dante's Divine Comedy in the first book, the Inferno, you know, gorgeous medieval Italian, a very bureaucratic, highly organized hell where everybody goes to their very specific place to suffer in a very particular way. Now, the idea that the suffering fits the crime goes way back in the Christian tradition, to some of the very earliest apocryphal texts related to hell. And of course, we all know Dante, and I'm not going to spend too much time on Dante. A precedent to Dante, though, in the 12th century is one of the most terrifying pieces of medieval literature. It's called The Vision of Tugnal. It's written in the mid-12th century, and it's the story of a simple knight who leaves his body and comes and is joined by an angel in the afterlife who takes him on a tour of hell to show him what awaits him if he doesn't change his ways. Now, this text is unusual because there are many tours of hell in the Middle Ages, many texts that relate to this, but most of them are about monks. And so we get monks who go on these tours and they come back and they warn their fellow monks, you know, we've got to be better, got to live a better way of life, you know, we've got to be more earnest in our prayers and more serious, or else we're going to go to hell. But the Vision of Tugnal was different because it was about a layperson. It was about a knight. It was about a normal guy who was a soldier. And some of the torments that he witnesses. Well, the other thing is, of course, this text is really funny in some ways too, because he's with an angel who's walking him through, and he doesn't just watch the torments take place; he has to partake in them. So every time he sees something and sees people being tortured, he knows he's going to be tortured as well, and this becomes a kind of, you know, trope within the story. But some of these torments are really, really terrifying, and some of them almost seem modern in how elaborate and weird they are. The one I'm going to read you right now is one I translated from the Latin for the book. And it concerns the punishment of monks and priests who fornicate. So this was a serious topic, and it was directed specifically at religious specialists. But the imagery could come out of a Ridley Scott horror movie. It sounds like Alien, as you'll see. And yet it was written in the 12th century in Latin. So here's the excerpt. As the angel led the way, they saw a beast very different from all the other beasts they had previously seen. It had 2 feet and 2 wings, a very long neck, and an iron beak. It even had iron claws, and from its mouth it vomited a relentless flame. This beast sat in a swamp that was frozen over with ice, where it devoured any souls it could find. And while they were in its stomach, these souls were reduced to nothing as their punishment. The beast then regurgitated them onto the surface of the frozen swamp, where their torments were renewed once again. All of the souls that descended into the swamp, men as well as women, were pregnant, and burdened in this way, they awaited the time when they would give birth. The offspring that they conceived stung their entrails like vipers, causing these wretched souls to thrash about in the fetid waters of a sea of death hardened over with ice. When the time came to deliver, they screamed, filling the depths with their cries as they gave birth to serpents. I repeat that not only the women, but also the men gave birth to them, not through those parts that nature made for this function, but through their arms and likewise through their chests, and the serpents came bursting out through all of their limbs. These newly born beasts had heads of burning iron and the sharpest beaks, with which they shredded the bodies from which they emerged. On their tails, they had many spines like twisted fishhooks, with which they pierced those souls that gave birth to them. These beasts sought to leave their hosts, but when they could not extract their tails, they turned their burning iron heads back into the bodies and did not stop consuming them until they were reduced to raw nerves and dry bones. So, lurid, horrific. Somebody is there in the 12th century, 800 years ago, imagining what kind of bodily torment would be suitable for individuals, especially religious specialists, who had sex when they weren't supposed to. these kind of images, of course, were a warning. They were a way to control a population that was adhering to a certain religious dogma, but also was terrified with the idea that the afterlife was simply going to be perpetual punishment. There was a saying in the early modern period that the fear of hell peopled heaven, and this is I think, true. The Catholic Church had a great deal of control over the population, especially a rural, relatively ignorant population that they could reach through preaching, because they had control of this imagery. Now, hell had a good 1,000 years in the limelight. It had a good reign. It had a little bit of competition from Purgatory, which took away a little of its edge, but it lost none of its power. Hell really only came to be contested in the early modern period during the Protestant Reformation, when Protestants tried very hard to distinguish themselves from Catholics. They all agreed about hell, right? The Protestants were not going to come out in the 16th century and say, oh, we're very different from the Catholics. We don't believe in hell. No, they absolutely believed in hell. But they really wanted to do away with all of this kind of weird imagery that the Catholics had developed over the course of the Middle Ages. They were not interested in giant birds in the hellish swamps eating souls and pooping them out, or vomiting them out, however he did it. No, they were much more likely to say that hell was in fact simply the absence of God. It was the pang of the torment of your conscience, that in the world to come, you would not enjoy God's eternal presence. This is one of the ways that Protestants distinguish themselves. But over the course of the 17th and 18th and into the 19th centuries, we can begin to see a certain amount of doubt coming into play. Doubt is a strong word, but I think it might be the right word here. Catholics and Protestants alike were really trying to justify in this period whether or not hell was something that accorded with what they understood to be God's mercy. Can you have a merciful, all-loving God and still have hell? Medieval thinkers got around this by simply saying, God will send you to hell based on his judgment. Do you understand his judgment? No. But nonetheless, it's his judgment, so go. You're going, right? Early modern thinkers and particularly 18th and 19th century thinkers really were troubled by this. They really thought, is hell necessary? Do we still need this idea? And so what we see over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and again with the rise of secularism, with the rise of critical study of the Bible, we begin to see a creeping doubt that is hell necessary even for believers? And this is really striking. But it doesn't matter. Hell maintains a very tenacious grip on Western society. 52% of Americans believe in hell. How many believe they're going there? Almost none of them. They believe their enemies are going there. They believe that other people are going there, of course, but not themselves. And this is probably hell's greatest triumph, which is, even if you're not part of the Christian tradition, you're not a believer, you know what hell is, because it dominates our society as a metaphor. We give hell to other people. And this is the most terrifying aspect of hell's triumph, is that it has now been, in the 20th century, removed entirely from a religious context, and it has become a dominant metaphor for the way we treat other people. So we give hell to other people. How do we do that? Well, we rain fire on our enemies. We drop nuclear bombs on them. We drop all sorts of bombs on people, right? This is a way to give them hell. We do the same thing in our political system when we, for the meagerest of crimes, we lock people away in solitary confinement for years on end. We give hell to the refugees who come to our borders for very legitimate reasons, and yet because they're different or because of whatever political agenda we have, we make life miserable for them. And in doing so hell may be on the decline from a religious point of view. We might have people who are actually questioning, even believers who are questioning whether hell exists. But as a larger cultural metaphor, hell dominates. Hell remains, hell abides, it endures. And it endures in an ironic way, because the hell of the 21st century is not arbitrated by a just God. It's arbitrated by human beings, fallible human beings who might, who just happen to be in power. Can we get rid of this? Can we do away with it? Is hell too tenacious to lose? Well, I would argue that hell, even from its very beginning, the idea of a punitive afterlife comes about because of injustice in our societies. We need to defer very bad people. We need to defer the judgment of very bad people to a deity, and we need to defer their punishment to the next life, because often the people in our societies who are very bad are immune to punishment. They're super powerful, right? They get away with things because of their power. And this is not just our present moment. This is an ancient thing, right? And so we can imagine the idea of hell emerging to kind of come to grips psychologically with the gross inequality and injustice that we see in our societies. So the great high priest or the great king, who is a terrible person, well, we can't do anything about them in this life, but we can take great satisfaction in thinking that some deity will punish them in the next life, right? They will go to hell. We will take great satisfaction in that. And that then serves its role. It provides some kind of catharsis for us, that the injustice will be righted. Now, will we one day outgrow hell? Only if we create a just society. We don't need to defer justice to the next world if we dispense justice correctly, fairly, properly in this one, right? Are we there yet? No. But we will be one day. Let's hope. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. If these topics interest you, seek out the Penguin Book of Hell by Penguin Classics. Keep your eyes open for the Penguin Book of Dragons and more, I hope, coming our way. And thank you so much for your time and your support of books in translation.